attendees, and then we need one slide or for you to talk about, to say something about the project that we.
Can you hear Shiji in the background discussing, still having a meeting with a student? Okay. With that.
Seems to be working.
Seems to be working okay. And now we'll go
yeah, okay, but still you want to present your project, right?
Okay, but we don't need to share the screen. It's better, more interesting without that.
A lovely video that I used.
Hello, you guys who are here. Is anybody else actually physically there?
Okay. We still got 7 minutes. People are still grabbing coffee and breakfast.
Yeah.
Or
likewise,
lunch or dinner or.
Okay, I'll see you in a bit.
Oh.
Hey, Jeff, it's great to see you.
Hey, Toby, how are you?
Really great to see you. I still remember very clearly when your students came to Telluride, I guess it was 2017 or 2018. Who were they that came and they set up this incredible localization system using paper plates, literally paper plates with crosses drawn on them. They just put a webcam on the ceiling.
I couldn't go that year. I think that was Tiffany and
Tiffany, yeah. Tiffany. Oh,
and then Scott Koziel, I think, was there.
Yeah. That was really lovely.
Yeah, I came the year before. Yep. Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while. How is everything? Yeah. Are you still getting back to California? Or are you staying?
Well, we haven't left Zurich since February last year, except for one day attempted car camping in Switzerland, which is hopeless. I mean, never go car camping in Switzerland. Go trekking. Go on those trails and stay in the huts in the Alps, but don't try to go car camping. It's not like the Indian country. Nothing like Indian country. Right? Yeah, it's stupid to try it even. Although it's incredibly popular. Every camping spot is completely full. But you end up being 2 meters away from somebody else, right next to the railroad tracks, behind some farmer's garage.
No, that's not really camping.
No, that was our experience, at least.
Yeah, actually, it's been very popular. I don't camp, but it's been very popular here too in recreational
too hot
vehicles,
now, though.
RVs.
Yeah.
Everyone's buying these RVs and
Yeah,
traveling
so
around
you're
to
gonna
figure
be
that
camping,
way.
dude. Yeah.
Hey,
Okay.
Jeff.
Hey, Emre, are you settled in Germany?
Yeah, well, I'm in Germany for sure.
Not
settled.
settled.
Settled is kind of 50%, but everything's fine.
Oh, good.
It's raining here for a change.
Oh, that's different. It's June gloom here, so get that to miss.
Cool.
Right. Are you all set for sharing your screen and things like that?
Can try. Looking good.
Seems to work.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Toby, as we're getting close to time to start, I think you've got the control for starting the Zoom recording.
Oh, thank you very much. Please remind me at the moment that we're going to start, actually. But one more thing I wanted to check was the co-host, right? Have you said everybody, who needs to be co-host?
Doesn't seem to really matter.
Doesn't seem to matter. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so then I guess you can.
I think, well, basically, if people start abusing the privilege and start randomly sharing their screen, then we'll put on the restrictions that we need to have someone be co-host. But until that happens, I think we're good.
So the current setting is that you cannot override somebody else's share.
Got it.
Okay.
Hey,
That
Jeff.
seems pretty good.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, I think you have 25 minutes.
Hey, Shichi. Yep.
Hey. And I make like a 1 minute introduction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff.
And also, Terry, just so that you know, Cornelia is going to be the moderator for our panel discussion.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. And how do we keep time? Is that for you, Terry, to do?
I guess that's my job, is to yell at people and say, "Oh, time to finish." So we'll see how well I do at that.
You'll be the bad guy.
All right. I'll keep track.
Be tough.
So-
Be tough. Please.
We were right on time yesterday, so that was amazing. So we'll see if we can continue that.
Yeah, and breaks, right? So maybe since they might be a little bit shorter. But do we have any breaks planned, Toby?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, I added breaks to the program.
Oh,
So
great.
Please,
Okay.
please attend to the program. In fact, you might even just show the schedule for today, right? To introduce what it is.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm sure people are looking at the schedule page. If not, they should be looking at the schedule page on the website.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like the Google Calendar didn't update. Okay.
Oh, here we go. I'll give you a quick schedule.
What is a break?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Like there is a.
Oh,
You can, by the way, you might demonstrate that each of those calendar items, if you just click on one, Jeff, for example, you can click on your own or the expert panel, you can click on that and see more about Jeff Krichmar. You can see more about yourself there. Isn't that cool?
Just what I want to know.
And same, you can read about everybody on the expert panel. You can see more about, Dana and Cornelia, all those people.
All right.
So
All
Luke
right,
did a
so
really nice job. Yeah. Okay.
We should get started. Toby, do you want to start the Zoom recording? And yes, so that everyone knows, we are both recording this in Zoom and we're also live streaming it to YouTube. If that's a problem for anyone, please keep your camera off. And I guess we will start with Shichi will introduce.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for the sensory motor integration topic area. And Jeff Krichmar is going to give the talk today. He's a faculty in the Department of Cognitive Sciences at UCI, University of California, Irvine. He's attended the Telluride Neuromorphic workshop multiple times, also along with his students, and has been working a lot on cognitive models for neurorobotic systems. And so he's going to speak about that today. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Shichi. Thank you, everyone. It's good to be back at Telluride again. I'm going to talk about my area of research, neurorobotics. I think it has very close ties, as you'll see, to neuromorphic engineering and neuromorphic cognition. And it also fits very closely with sensory motor integration. It's connecting the brain, the body to the environment and closing the loop. And this is excerpts from an upcoming book that Tiffany Hu, who's a veteran of Telluride as well, and myself have been writing. It should be out this fall, I hope. So we'll see. Anyway, let's give you a little bit of what the book's about too. So what is neurorobotics? It's an approach that combines closing the loop, brain. So you have an artificial brain, a body, behavior. And so that forces you to consider how behavior affects the environment and how the environment affects the design of the agent. And then that strongly relies on sensory information from the environment and taking action. And then it's a robust test. It considers the limits of what you can actually do in the real world. And then testing in the real world, simulations are nice, but once you're in the real world, you reduce a whole bunch of biases. So real worlds are complex, they're noisy, they don't come with rules. So it's a more rigorous and realistic test of algorithms. And on the flip side, this approach can tell you a lot about how the brain works. So it gives you a holistic way of testing brain theories. So you can analyze and perturb your artificial brain in ways that a neuroscientist couldn't with current technology. And you can put your robot in laboratory conditions that are similar to what an animal experiment would be. And then that gives you a nice direct comparison. But then you can take it into more natural conditions, which would be hard to do with an animal model, and see how these brain functions would respond to a real dynamic world and in an uncontrolled environment. So this might actually be a way to build autonomous systems with some level of biological intelligence. So this talk will go over some design principles that Tiffany and I have come up with over the years of doing these neurorobotic experiments. And then I'll tie it back to neuromorphic engineering because I think there's very close ties to that. So they fall into three categories. There's kind of the reactive actions and reactions. There's also the adaptive behavior where you learn on the intermediate term and over a lifetime. And then interestingly, when you're in the real world and you're actually an agent with motivations, there's all these trade-offs. I call them behavioral trade-offs, and they lead to interesting behavior. And interesting to me, and a sub-area of my research, is they're regulated by low-level chemicals in your brain, neuromodulators and hormones. Okay, so let's just go through in a little more detail some of these design principles. So the first one is kind of the reaction. Every action has a reaction is what I call it. And one of the important things is embodiment. So the brain needs a body. And that body can actually give you a lot of efficiency. So we're under extreme metabolic constraints. So on the left, our brains do a lot of efficient coding, and neuromorphic hardware engineers have really tapped into that because brain activity is sparse. It has reduced representation, so you can represent things in less neurons, and it adjusts to what the input is coming in. But the body is also extremely efficient. So you look at walking robots, and robots that are designed, engineered to walk and locomote take a lot of energy, but we take very little energy because we use a lot of passive dynamics. We use gravity and friction to our benefit, and that the way our body is built saves a lot of energy and saves a lot of brain processing. And this is some early work I did. We were trying to capture a soccer ball to get ready for RoboCup, and capturing a fast-moving soccer ball, even with a very good computer vision system, was almost impossible. So what do we come up with? We came up with what I call an area of morphological computation. We put a little hula hoop around the robot. It could then trap the ball, feel it, look at it, and then do what the brain's better at doing, planning and making decisions about whether to pass or shoot on the goal. So that's what Rolf Pfeiffer and Josh Bongar would call morphological computation. The body is doing some of the heavy lifting for the brain. And sensory motor integration, which is in the topic area for us, that's also important. And in the brain, once you get past primary sensory, which is this dark blue, and primary motor, once you get one or two hops from that, and the brain is a small world network, there's no real difference between sensory and motor. Even though us cognitive scientists and neuroscientists say that, there is a ton of shared information. And that's what Joachim Fuster was trying to show with this picture, is like we're getting multimodal information very early on in the brain, and there's no real sensory area because so-called sensory areas are getting a lot of motor information and vice versa. So there's sensory motor integration in the brain throughout the brain. And what can that do for you? Well, this is an early robotics experiment. We're trying to do figure ground segregation, and this robotic arm is flailing, and it's very hard to pull out this little block from the table. But once the arm hits that block, it moves, and also it violates an expectation of what the arm was expecting. And so then this object pops out, and now you have figure ground segregation. And you can imagine this was a standard camera. This would work really well with a dynamic vision sensor like the Davis, for example. And then another area that's important for biology in general, which I think we should take into consideration when we make our systems, is degeneracy. So the brain, or biology, I should say, has multiple pathways to achieve the same outcome, which is what degeneracy means. It's a little bit different than redundancy. And you see that throughout biology. You have the genetic code, so there's triplets that make an amino acid, 4 base pairs, so you could have 64 possible combinations, but we only have 20 amino acids. And that's an example of degeneracy. But you can look at any level, at the organism level, how we move around. There's multiple ways to get to the same position, or how we communicate. There's multiple ways to communicate. And this early work by our group, I think, nicely showed degeneracy at multiple levels. This robot is doing what's known as the Morris water maze without the water. So it's moving around, building up place information. And there's a platform there that it can't see, but it can feel. And so at the individual level, this particular individual used the blue wall to bounce off to find the platform. Other runs used the red wall, and other runs went straight to the platform. So that was degeneracy in the behavior. This robot has multiple sensory streams, so even if we knocked out one or sometimes even 2 sensory streams, it could still solve this task. And then at the neural level, it had degeneracy. It developed what's known as place cells, so neurons that would fire in particular locations. And if you looked at the place cell on one run and saw the neurons that led to that place cell being active, and then compared it to another run, there'd be completely different sets of neurons actually activated. So there are different pathways to get that place cell to be active. And very quickly, another area that we should consider in our designs is multitasking. So we are multitasking animals, and we are event-driven, and that's the design neuromorphic hardware. And this is nice work by Tony Prescott's group that modeled the basal ganglia, and it looks a lot like the old subsumption architecture, where there are different action sensory streams, and depending on the motivation and the sensory event, the robot will do a different action. And in this case, it goes from when it's fearful, hanging around the edges, to when it's hungry, to going to the center of the room and picking up cylinders. But the point is that we are multitasking and event-driven, and we're not a sequential operating system. Okay, the second set of principles have to do with adaptive behavior and value. So what signals what is good or bad for you, or maybe just what is interesting, and this can shape your behavior. And I could talk all day about neuromodulation, but just very quickly, there are a bunch of areas in the subcortical region called neuromodulators and also neurohormones that send chemicals to the rest of the brain and actually down to the peripheral nervous system that can shape learning and cause behavior to change. And value gives you the ability to predict. So this work on the left is from June Tani's group, and it's using value to predict what this object will do, and then it moves it's able to move its arm around and keep up with this object. Even when it changes fast, it'll know it's predicting what it's going to do. And it used value sensory feedback to do that. But value sometimes when we do this in robots is artificial. We artificially say what's good or bad. So what about real value? And that's something that I think is an area that's open. But this is a step towards it. This is work by Cully and J.B. Moray and Jeff Clune with this robot that built up an understanding, a mental, spatial awareness of its body. And it injured one of its legs. And so now it's doing mental simulation of potential good gaits if it didn't have one leg. So it only has 5 out of 6. And so it first tests it in its brain, picks out good potential gaits, and then tries them out, and very quickly is able to recover from this real injury. So it was able to recognize the injury and then also recover and adapt. And so that's, I think, getting at least close to having real value tied to the robot behavior. And when you make a robot video, you have to show it in slow motion for some reason. So there you go. There's the nice 5-legged gait, which is nice and straight and moving forward. All right, so at a longer level, we have learning and memory consolidation. And memory consolidation means that you're taking information in the short term, remembering it, and then putting it into your long memory store. And this is an interaction between the hippocampus and the cortex. But what's been shown recently is that if you have information that fits within a context, or what we like to call a schema, you can very rapidly put that into the cortex. And so Tiffany Hu, in her dissertation work, was very interested in this and designed hippocampus interacting with a medial prefrontal cortex model and tested on a robot. So here's the idea. She types in teddy bear. The robot is looking for a teddy bear, but it's also building a schema of this classroom. So this is the first time. So it's basically building up where things are in this room, and then it finally finds the teddy bear. Now, if you cue it again with a teddy bear a few times later, it knows exactly where the teddy bear is and can pick it up and bring it back. Now we put it in another room that has objects that would go for a break room. There's more food objects. It realizes that this is a new context, so it builds a whole new schema for this room. And is also being able to pick up objects in that room. Now the big test is, what if we put it back into the original classroom? Does it have catastrophic forgetting? Well, no. We cue with a new object that should be in the classroom, it picks it up immediately. And what if we cue it with an object it's never had to pick up before, like a banana? Well, it knows a banana goes with the context of it should be on the table where the other food is. And so then it has a likelihood of where a food should be on that table, and it goes searching there first and finds it. So we think this might be the brain's way of actually dealing with memory over long periods of time, and also it overcomes catastrophic forgetting in a very neurobiological way. All right, let's see, doing okay on time. So the third set of principles is behavioral trade-offs. And let me just touch on a few of these, but the world is full of contradictions and conflict always makes a good story. And depending on our needs and motivations, it can trigger what we do. So there's an obvious one. Do we want reward to get rewards or avoid punishment? But that can be thought of as, do we want to be really active or do we want to be withdrawn? How much uncertainty in the world are we willing to cope with? Do we want to explore for things or do things that have worked before, exploit the things that have worked? At a very raw level, do we want to get food and forage, or do we want to fight and defend our home turf? And if we have a stressful immediate situation, an emergency, we may have trigger our stress hormones, or do we want to just chill and be calm? And then lastly, we could be social, interact, or we could be solitary. And notice I put here, all of these are triggered and shaped in a very, in some way by neuromodulators or hormones. So let's look at one that we did to explore some of these trade-offs with our group. And there's a behavioral opponency between dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine is related to reward prediction. It's also related to novelty. So, but if you are high on dopamine, you're quite invigorated, you're active. Now, what about serotonin? Serotonin might be related to your risk level or harm aversion. So the serotonin could push you towards punishment, or harm aversion could push you towards inhibition of movement. And so we wanted to model that on robots. So we had levels of dopamine and serotonin artificially in this robot. And we did an open field test, which is what you would do with a mouse. And when they're scared and in an unfamiliar environment, they'll hug the walls like this Roomba is doing. And then it'll want to be, because its serotonin levels are high right now, it'll want to go and hide. So that's inhibition or withdrawn behavior. So it's heading towards its Roomba charging station. At some point, it realizes this is not an unsafe area. I'm going to be more invigorated and explore and try and do some reward seeking, like investigating an object. And what's interesting is you can change the levels in this model of the dopamine and make it completely risk-taking and obsessive compulsive that it never hides, or you can increase the serotonin levels and you can cause it to have an anxiety disorder where it hovers in the corner and never comes out. And so it just nicely in the simple model showed how these trade-offs can interplay and how they can be controlled by very low level processes. All right, so what does this have to do with neuromorphic engineering? Well, and kind of going way back 5 years ago, when I was at Telluride with Tiffany Hu and a bunch of others, two interesting pieces of work came out of this meeting from our group. And one was a path planning algorithm that uses spiking neurons, and another was self-driving, showing that the power of using neuromorphic chips with robots. So let's very briefly go through these. So the spike wave algorithm fits nicely in neuromorphic hardware, where each location is represented by a spiking neuron. And once the neuron spikes, it's connected to its neighbors, and then it causes them to spike. But these ones are not spiking because the delays represent the cost of traveling through space. So there's an obstacle in the middle of this environment. So the wave is slower to go through that obstacle. Once the wave hits the goal, then we can back out all the neurons that cause that to fire, get this chain of neurons, which is represented in an address event representation. And so this actually yields an optimal or near optimal path. And so we tested this in Telluride, and then we came back to Irvine and kind of refined it. And on the left is a map where it only takes into consideration the perimeter of the area, so it goes straight across the lawn. And then on the right, it used a map that took into consideration that it's easier to travel over the pavement. Tiffany we didn't have our road following algorithm on the robot yet, so Tiffany had to follow it closely. And you see the trajectories below, but this nicely adapts to the cost of traversal in the environment. And because it's spiking and the way it was designed, it fit nicely. And during Telluride, the group from Johns Hopkins put it on True North. And then Jamie from Manchester put it on a Spinnaker. So it nicely maps to neuromorphic hardware. I think Shichi show this tomorrow, but I can tell you a little bit more about this work. So at the same meeting, we worked with the IBM group, Ricardo and Andrew, and Jacob was there to build a convolutional neural net from training data that was taken on trails in Telluride. And this doesn't do it justice. This trail is extremely steep and rocky, and there's a huge drop off to the left. And so that's why there's a rope there, because we strapped with Velcro True North onto this robot. And I think it was the first time that they closed the loop with the True North on a robot and embedded it. And I can go into longer stories about some of the stuff that happened. But what really struck me with this is that robot is, off the shelf RC, not a car, but an RC robot. That's a hobby grade robot with a small nickel metal hydride battery. That nickel metal hydride battery was running the robot for half an hour to an hour and also running the True North chip. So it really says that, hey, these low power chips could be very useful for embedded systems and for me, for robotics. So wrapping up, sensory motor integration neurorobotics really closes the loop. You want to consider these when you're designing your projects, that you have to look at the kind of action and reaction level and the short-term plasticity and building up behavioral repertoires or even innately embedding behavioral repertoires. And then on top of that, you build in adaptive behavior. And that means you have to have value and motivation. And as you learn, the learning gives you predictions. And then consider putting behavioral trade-offs or looking at behavioral trade-offs in whatever test you do of your system, because that actually makes the behavior more interesting, more natural. And I've just been interested in it because it is regulated by neuromodulator and hormones. Okay, and lastly, I think neurorobotics and neuromorphic engineering go hand in hand. Neurobiological inspired algorithms, they're just a natural fit for neuromorphic chips. The fabric of the chips, the event-driven multitasking nature of the spiking neurons, they really, it's a good fit. And natural systems are a model for increasing autonomy. So looking at neuroscience and neurorobotics to increase autonomy for our embedded systems, I think is important. And I think neuromorphic engineering and neuromorphic chips allow robots to operate at the edge, or could allow them. There's a lot of situations where you'd be far from power sources and human innovation. You need that increased autonomy. You need to be able to operate for long periods of time. So I think this is a very good match. And I will stop there. I don't know if there's time for questions. Or should we just go right into our discussion?
Let's see, what's the time?
We are right on time.
We're right on time, and there's no break before the panel discussion?
The panel is supposed to start immediately, and then the break is at the end of the panel.
Okay.
Did you see the question? Did you see the question though in the chat?
Yeah. So
yeah.
Question in the chat.
In the chat. Sorry, I don't see in the chat.
I don't have a chat in my.
I don't have a chat.
Slack.
In Slack.
Slack questions channel. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're there,
Yeah, there we go. In the SMI one, or
in questions itself.
Oh, Andreas nicely put in the SMI channel the Johns Hopkins work that his group did with Kate on the spike propagation in IBM True North. Yeah.
Yeah.
People contributed to that. Jeff, you gave a great talk. It wasn't my group. I think Caitlin and a few others. I mean, okay, I just that's just
yeah. I remember you were there, and Caitlin was there, and a few others, and even there was a group you brought from area high school in Baltimore that actually did a lot of the data collection too for the other project. Yeah,
Black students from Baltimore being part of this project, which is really
yeah, it was very nice. Yeah.
And by the way, I want to say that they both went on to have careers in computer science and biology, neurobiology.
Oh, yay. That's a great success story.
Okay, so there are 2 questions I see.
Okay.
So Jeff, can you see the
Yep.
questions?
Multimodal associate, do you think the brain falls? You know, I am from the Edelman group, so I'm a very strong proponent of reentry. But I think very quickly on, there's some areas that have very early primary that are unimodal, but then very quickly they get multimodal information. And even the primary visual and auditory areas get top-down projections from higher order, if you will, areas. So it's just a mix. And the other work actually came sort of out of Edelman's group. Olaf Sporens really pushed the idea of looking at network theory on the brain, and it's a small world network. So even if you're in a primary unimodal map, you're only a very short number of connections away from stuff that's multimodal and association cortex. Another question, do you feel there's aware of approaches to provide theoretical guarantees of stability? Oh,
A tough question.
that's, yeah, no, it's not only a tough question. There's not a good answer for engineers.
Yeah.
That's the issue that's with biology, is messy, and it's hard to get stability and guarantees. You can apply that, but that's part of the beauty of it. It's you know, a stochastic dynamic system. So we like to say that no 2 neurorobots are ever alike. We've tried to clone them and do the exact same thing, but the brain activity is shaped by complexities from the environment or slight differences in experience, and that shapes the behavior as well. So that's an issue. It might be, I always thought it was a good issue, but it's an issue for engineering.
Okay, so I guess we should move on to the panel discussion. What do you think? And
Sounds good.
Can you make Bodo the co-host, because he's going to show some slides? And our moderator is Cornelia Fermüller. I hope she's there. Cornelia.
Bodo, you should be able to share your slides now. And also, if there's more questions for Jeff, please continue to post them in the Slack channel. And if you have a chance to answer them over there, that would be wonderful at some point.
Where are they actually before you get going in the Slack channel?
So there is a Slack channel that is just questions.
Oh, I don't have that on my.
You may have to click on channels and then,
add it. Okay.
And then, yeah, browse channels.
I'll do that right now while you guys are setting up.
For some reason, I don't see it either. Yeah.
So
You have to add it.
you have to click on the plus sign and then browse channels and then find it.
I'll post it again on the announcements.
Oh, okay.
Is everybody able to see the slides?
Yep.
Great.
All set. Well, go for it. First panel discussion for this year's Telluride. See how this goes.
Cornelia. So Cornelia is going to be our moderator.
Okay. So welcome to the panel discussion that has been prepared by Shichi and Bodo. And we have on the panel Tiago Marques. You're here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay. Who is a postdoctoral fellow at the McGovern Institute of Brain Research at MIT, working with Professor Di Carlo. And he works at the intersection of neuroscience and machine learning, using deep learning to study primate vision and developing new computer vision algorithms. And he had recently a nice contribution on the development of a new generation of more robust CNNs for object recognition based on human vision. We also have on the panel Jeff Krichmar, who doesn't need an introduction now. We have Emre Neftci. He was organizing yesterday but I say a few words. Since his PhD thesis, he has been working on mixed signal neuromorphic system. He was then a postdoctoral fellow in Gerd Kaubenberg's lab to investigate models of probabilistic state-dependent sensory processing in large-scale multineuron systems. He passed through same university, Krichmar, is UC Irvine, and he just became group leader at the Peter Grünberg Institute at Jülich, Germany. So I think he just started a few weeks ago. And his research focuses on theoretical and computational modeling of learning in neural systems that exploit the characteristics of neuromorphic hardware. We also have Dana Ballard, who really doesn't need an introduction. He has contributed so much to computer vision, always new ideas. He is right now at the CS department of the University of Texas at Austin, after being many years at the CS department at the University of Rochester. And related to this, his research has been on computational theories of the brain with an emphasis on human vision and motor control. In the 80s already, he designed a binocular camera control system that they also moved on an arm, so it could move around. And this led to an increased understanding of the role of behavior and vision. In particular, that visual computations can be much simpler when interacting with the 3D world. And currently he's interested in pursuing this line of research with, in the context of action understanding human natural behavior in VR systems. And then it's me, I'm Cornelia Fermüller. I'm a research scientist at the University of Maryland. And I've been working on computer vision, modeling, human vision, and robotics. And related to this discussion, we have been studying vision for active vision systems. And recently in our group, we have worked on drones, where we try to integrate classic vision, event vision systems, as well as other sensors such as IMUs, to solve simple tasks directly through this integration. So let us put up the questions. Okay. What sensory features are useful in closed-loop dynamic control setups? Can we learn more useful features from sensors producing stream of events versus frames? Given that the visual system has learned a set of features such as RGC types, should we use them directly as feature extractors to any higher level model? Can we use task-specific feedback to modulate the feature extractors? So maybe let me comment a little bit. I have been working on TVS. I think there is, and we have been working on vision related, putting it on drones. My bet has been there is additional information in events, especially, I mean, of course, it's fast, that everybody knows, so we have a very short delay. But there's also information if we look at the past, if we look at these surfaces that some of us have worked already. There are some papers that have used features over space-time. So far, they have been in the old framework constructed, but they can also be learned, of course. And they encode really useful information at the low level about how different things move together, that it's very difficult when we have occlusions, when things move together, to disentangle this. And I think here, regarding the feature, there is additional information inside. So whether we should use these features directly or have any higher level models, we definitely can use some directly for lower level tasks. When I'm talking about these movements that also Jeff has shown, the robot moving around, it needs to solve a set of basic visual capabilities, including it needs to know its own motion, it needs to find other things moving, it needs to find out who is going and where and what going to intersect. So these problems that we call generally motion segmentation, time of contact. For these, we can use simple features directly instead of going through the classic pipeline that is used in computer vision and robotics, which is known under the term SLUM. So the idea being we'll just make a model of the world, simultaneous localization and mapping. And if we have that model, then we can solve problems. But that is, of course, very costly, computationally costly. So if we want to do things like just going around in the ideas of active vision, purposive vision, we can do many things. Now, when it comes to with these features directly, for example, very early on, I have written a paper that just by looking at patterns of image motion, you could just go in certain directions and just observe how the pattern is, and that's your control signal. But when it comes to higher level, okay, that's debatable. When it comes to recognition, how much do we need to recognize in order to make a plan? We definitely need to step up somehow. Can we use?
So Cornelia, I guess I'm curious that in biology, since the visual system has to deal with, planning and, multiplexing between different sets of tasks and so on, you feel like it's learned kind of a general set of features. And so I was wondering if Tiago, can you comment on that? On what do you think? Should we just start with those set of features and then build models that use those features directly, or do you think we should just use a restricted set that's based on the task that the system that you intend to use?
I think, questions in engineering, the answer is going to be it depends. I would like to. So, if for visual tasks that humans excel at, I would say it does make sense to use visual features that we know exist in the primate brain, and particularly in the human brain. These are features that have evolved during the course of millions of years to be efficient and to be good at solving the type of visual tasks that we do. However, there may be some engineering applications that we don't want to be restricted by human level performance, and we may want to go beyond human vision. In that sense, we may be undermining the model's performance by restricting to biological features. The other thing that I'd like to comment is that we also tend to assume that we know all about low-level human vision. And while it's true that we have models for retina and we have models for V1, these models are still far from perfect. We can still not explain all of the variants in the neuronal recordings in early visual areas. And so by implementing these mathematically constrained simple models of retina and V1, because we say that we're trying to approximate early human vision, we may actually also be limiting the extent that we can approximate human vision, because these models are not perfect. And so by allowing these models to be optimized in the context of a task, with some architectural priors, we may actually even achieve features that are more brain-like. So I think it's going to depend on that. There are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that, of course, if we use already fixed pre-trained features, we do not need to train them, so we may need less data. We also may be less prone to overfitting, and so the model may be more robust for some type of or able to generalize for other image domains. However, we may be limiting the capabilities of the model because we are just assuming that this very simple model, very simple mathematical models are the correct way, and they may not be.
Okay, thanks. And Jeff, since you've been building these systems for a while, you put your engineer's hat on now.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the first bullet, like, can we learn more by streams versus frames? And very early on, we realized if you take the visual scene as a stream, you get invariant object recognition because you're seeing a continuous version of whatever you're looking at, and you're seeing it from different angles. So even in a very simple system, we had translation, scale, and position invariance in our artificial visual system. So I think it's important to use the stream and not just process each frame. And I think some of the neuromorphic sensors are just completely designed to do that.
Good point.
Yeah.
But could I ask a question, which I think is very pertinent here for any kind of it's pertinent for neuromorphic spiking hardware, which naturally should be able to do recurrence, because of the nature of the system that's asynchronous processing, but also becoming popular are these convolutional recurrent networks that I like a lot as models of Cortex, conf LSTMs.
I think that's the second question.
No, but that has to do with this this last question. Like, can we use task-specific feedback to modulate the feature extract? I'd like to know how that would happen in recurrent neural network, and particularly like an attention network that's now becoming very popular in AI.
Yeah, we've been working a lot with recurrent neural nets and in the attention networks, and then I mentioned briefly Jun Tani. So he's made hierarchies of recurrent neural nets where you have slower processing at the higher level and faster processing at the lower level, and it comes out looking very much like a primary to frontal cortex kind of dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, and Tiago, you have something.
Can I make a comment? Also, I think this relates to what Jeff and Cornelia said. So Toby, I remember you were showing your movies sometimes of the recordings when you were driving through Colorado roads, and there's just not much happening there, right? So it's just very boring. And so when Cornelia is mentioning that there's timing information embedded into spikes, there's actually not much behaviorally embedded into those spikes. So what are actually the kind of features where we need those events? Is it in order to segment objects, for instance? That's a question for Cornelia.
Yeah, I think segmentation is really one of the things, the task where events will help, betting on it. And as I mentioned also, okay, of course it's instantaneous, but I think we can also build a history from these events by keeping track and representing them as new features that may give additional information. Also, I think one thing, when you talk also, Tiago, about features needing to be relearned, I think the important thing is here, they can be relearned in terms of object recognition, but also in terms of a temporal task, which is somewhat different. Like, do I learn features when the system needs to do something low level, pursuing, avoiding, landing? Mm-hmm. So yeah. I
was just curious because given that we have limited resource, even the brain, right? So you would think you want to have a general set of, say, edge detectors, even though we don't really do that nowadays, right? But you can imagine you're doing a task which requires you to attend to vertical edges, say, because that gives you some sort of reward. Then you think the visual system would then put more resource on those neurons that can detect vertical edges, or it could maybe adapt the receptive fields of other neurons so they also start detecting vertical edges, right? Because why not use the resource that you have instead of making this neurons with fixed receptive fields, if you like, and not adapting to your environment?
Yeah, that's correct. Goal-driven top-down attention does modulate those feature detectors, and it does some recruiting, and it also does some build saliency maps, which are now kind of popular in AI systems too. So, so it can really shape basically your perception, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
But even beyond just attention mechanisms, also longer term plasticity. There's a lot of work now, mostly done in the rodent visual system, where study representations in early visual areas during the course of task training, and we do see that features that are more behaviorally relevant for the animal, their representations become more defined, or let's say more cortical real estate gets allocated for those features. But it's still not clear how that is done. And I think this relates to one thing that we already discussed, and I guess this slide that we have now about feedback and the importance of feedback in the systems. And it's important to draw the distinction when we're talking about feedback, whether this feedback is being used for some type of continual learning, or it's a feedback that is being used for just inference. Because many times when we study, or maybe just in the brain when we look at connectivity and purely anatomy, when we look at feedback connections, we don't know whether those feedback connections are actually having a role for computing, for inference, for processing of a certain image or stream of events, or whether they're just there for allowing the system to learn. And so that becomes important, and to this a big weight when designing neuromorphic systems, whether we want feedback that is actually used, either via attention or other mechanism for inference, or it's there to allow a continuous adaptation and long-term changes in the context of the task.
Yeah. I think so this other question that we have of stateless versus stateful neurons, I think this is partially because we noticed that CNNs are used a lot, right? In many machine learning tasks, it's almost like you don't need recurrent layers, except for maybe the very top of the model. So I was wondering if any of you could touch on this, or if any feelings of whether we should actually even have stateful neurons, even if it's a CNN network. Would that allow us to show that we can solve a task better?
Wouldn't you need state anytime you have a task that has some sort of temporal aspect to it?
Yes,
that's
true.
And anything that needs some sort of planning and not just classification, I would imagine you're going to need state at some level. Yeah.
So does that mean you only need state at the very top layers or the higher layers? But not at the
I don't
bottom?
know about need. I mean, I just know the brain has state at all layers and interactive, but the advent of convolutional neural nets, or the re-advent, was this feed-forward architecture. But now I think some of the newer stuff is having a lot more feedback and recurrent loops.
I would challenge that point of view.
All right.
Because, I mean, if you look at what's happening in natural language processing now, actually the state-of-the-art networks, now transformers and so on, are actually feed-forward networks. And even when you think of CNNs, memory is the key point here when we talk about state, right? So the memory is actually is not necessary if all the information you need to compute is available at the input. Right, so I think that's there's a question here of go on, Toby.
I don't like that. I think it's brain dead. It's like they're using an FIR filter instead of an IR filter.
For sure,
you have this big window that has everything that you might possibly want to access, and then your network is supposed to infer. It might do it nicely with dilated kernels and stuff like that, but it's still a brain dead solution compared to an IR filter.
For sure, and that's exactly what I was going to say. The brain is telling
you, yeah. Okay.
So that the statefulness here may be a way of implementing that kind of memory in a better way, because it tells you which aspects you should learn, but it makes the problem much harder to solve.
I feel it's not language processing when we're talking about the problems discussed here in a dynamic world where we have to iteratively adjust. Otherwise, we could I mean, we would have to design closed form solutions that work for every scenario if we don't go.
Can anybody ask questions?
Yes, Andreas?
Yeah, so can we talk a little bit about timescales? Because in short timescales, maybe recurrent is really not important, but in longer timescales, recurrence will be important, you know? So I think timescales matter, and whether you have feed-forward or recurrent, I think.
Absolutely do not agree. I do not agree with you even on that, Andreas, I'm sorry. You know, it's exactly the recurrent.
Money, man, you know, money talks.
No.
Not me, but those people.
Okay, all right.
I think it's fair to view the transformers, architectures, and all of those attentional mechanisms as computational tricks for emulating a recurrent or a memory-driven process. And so I don't necessarily think that it's reasonable to draw inferences about biological computation from that context. But I think rather than thinking of it as recurrence, I think you kind of want to figure out how you integrate what types of plasticity are necessary, right? Like there's the short and the long-term timescales. There's this understanding that you're going to need to rope in short-term memory and long-term memory. I think the transformer architectures kind of emulate some of that behavior through a brute force, massive amount of feed-forward computation. But I would never go as far as to say that's the most efficient. It's just efficient given the strengths of hardware that, if you have a TPU pod available to you, it's a really appealing abstraction, but it's for computational purposes.
Since I started with this argument, and I see Terry Stewart is still here. So, you guys were working on these Legendre memory units, which is thinking of place codes but for time, right? So that is in some ways bringing the past information available to you at a given time. So, essentially a place code for time. So that means that you can then use structures like transformers in some way, but that makes, again, the learning problem a little bit harder.
Yeah, and talking about learning, there we go.
So what form of learning is required for an agent to navigate in a closed loop setup? Maybe Emre wants to comment?
So I think so to touch the point that Andreas was making about timescales, and also now moving from the statefulness, it's very tough. Well, the more memory you have, the harder it is to learn, right? So when you learn, there's learning at different timescales. Learning at short timescales is relatively easy. Learning at longer timescales require you to have additional memories and in order to learn. So I think that is probably the most challenging aspect of closed loop learning, which is that if the agent doesn't know which piece of information is important to it as it's experiencing the world, and has to learn from it and find which cues are important for it to solve a task. And so how do we solve that long-term, those longer timescales associations? I think that's one of the key points in also solving closed loop learning.
I would add that I think that's important. I think having a memory system and a short-term and a long-term memory system. I think reinforcement learning is key. As I said in my talk, value is important. So the motivation and the feedback, like Emre said, that you're getting from the environment. So reinforcement learning. If you're going over a long time period, Steve Dice brought this up in the discussion earlier, having an internal model. So that sort of pushes you towards model-based reinforcement learning or other things, because over a long period of time, you have to build a model of what you think your outcomes will be and be a little more predictive. So I think all of those things listed there are going to be important for especially for a closed loop, because every action you take, you have an expectation, and then every action you take is driven by a motivation, and then the new sensory information you have is checked with your internal model to see if your internal model is accurate. If not, then you have to adapt, and so on and so on. Yeah.
And do we need different learning rules for each level in the hierarchy, or do you believe that the same learning rule could be used?
I'm guessing. I mean, it depends how complicated the system. I'll let someone else talk, but I'm guessing you're going to need multiple learning rules. But I mean, it depends. You know, if it's a three-week workshop, that's hard to do. You can do a lot of interesting things with one learning rule in an interesting setup.
Well, you know, in terms of different learning rules, we can define what's a different learning rule, but I would rather push towards learning rules in which you have special cases which might apply to different areas. I mean, if you think of three-factor rules, and I guess we're going to have a couple of topics here, we're going to also implement these three-factor rules in the work groups. The three-factor rule is like presynaptic, postsynaptic, like STDP, but you have this additional reward or error term. Now, if you remove that error, so that is always equal to 1, then you have STDP. Is that a different learning rule? But in some ways, it's the same, right? It's just a special case of another one. And I think that's the way to think of it, because then we can tie in very nicely gradient descents and do learning pretty efficiently on even stateful systems.
Yeah, but I always wondered about that because you're now multiplying 3 numbers together, right? And so on a computer, yes, you could have, you know, any kind of precision you want, and it would work, right? But you know, when you build an actual physical system, it's
no generally. Well, the third number is it's also a postsynaptic, usually postsynaptic, so it doesn't come from 3 different places. Just it needs to have the postsynaptic neuron be kind of you know, modulate the learning.
Okay,
it's not a trinapse, I guess.
So if you take the most general, you can always explain the simpler ones. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Should we move on the last?
Yes, last question.
How to design an objective that generalizes well to a wide range of natural conditions? Can we extend previous reflex-based works to incorporate long-term planning aspects? Okay, so is RL the solution? Or are there other solutions? We know there's lots of work also in planning that they have developed, the community has developed very efficient methods based on trees. Maybe Jeff is an expert on this.
You know, when I've designed things, especially for behavior, I look to natural systems and what kind of behaviors, what kind of tasks they do, especially if I want to have some sort of natural condition. I look at what natural condition the organism might be in, etc. So that I guess what I'm saying is sometimes the experimental paradigm drives behavior, and then you have to look at well, what things would I need to solve this problem? So I kind of approach it from more of a problem solving rather than from the other direction, which is, what type of learning rules am I testing?
Yeah, we're coming to higher level tasks.
Yeah.
So we get the more difficult and less understood it becomes.
That's true too.
And of course, the more the more it becomes an individual learning.
Yeah.
Grow up in different environments, so we learn different things.
Yeah, I mean, when we've looked at how animals forage, and then we designed an experiment for that, or like I showed, we looked at animal models for anxiety and obsessive compulsive, and so we modeled that, and then so we first thought about, all right, what kind of cues are there that we could make for the robot or the system, and then what kind of brain areas are people looking at when they're testing this on animals, and then that sort of led to, all right, now what kind of learning rules do we need? So that's only one approach. I mean, that's the way we've kind of approached.
Right. I mean, in our own group, we have still tried to come up with general things that apply even across high-level things, like how can you break up actions, for example, according to their utility, and then still come up with some primitives that are generally true to string things.
do think behavioral primitives are important just to get you out of the box. And it's certainly, I don't feel like it's cheating because I think most organisms have innate behavior. So building that in can get you kind of a start, and then you can build more interesting behaviors on top of that.
And it also constrains how they can be stringed in time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, Cornelia, I think we running into the 6 o'clock time.
Okay.
For the next speaker. I'd like to thank Cornelia for being the moderator, and for the panelists, Jeff and Emre, Bodo, Toby, Andreas, whoever participated in the conversation, Guido, Dana.
There's also a bunch of questions on the web you can look at. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think it was a great discussion. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your contribution.
Thank you.
And,
thank you all.
Thanks, Tiago, for participation.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to the conversation continuing in the questions section. Well, I think we should just go straight on, since we do have a slightly shorter program today than yesterday, because the last podcast.
How about break? Biological break.
30-second 2-minute break. We'll do a 2-minute break, and then we'll get things started up. Because yes, it would be good to let people get a drink of water at least.
Please try to remind me to start the recording again. It's still going on YouTube, actually. I'm not sure how to pause that.
Yep. Cool. So we will be back up in a moment. Schedule. So that's what we'll be starting in just a moment.
That's good.
Who will be, so do we have, Nitish, do you want to test your screen sharing? Oh, I suppose I'm screen sharing, so you can't.
So I'm here. You need to stop the share.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, so if I'm good, let me try this. Do you see my screen?
I see your screen. It's got all the extra stuff there. Oh, there we go. Now it's full screen. Perfect.
Got it? Okay.
Yep.
So I'll wait for a go ahead because when I see the screen, I don't see you guys. Okay. So,
okay. Yep. I will verbally tell you.
Okay.
Give people another minute.
Indeed. Okay. Oh, I'm back at Hopkins fully for last 1 year. Okay. Yeah, pandemic did it, man. I mean, no more globe trotting. Okay, that's what's last century.
Oh well, we'll see you more often, I guess.
I've been around, but zooming.
And with a new chair that we have, which is
is that announced? I mean, I was in touch with that person, but I don't know if it's official.
Hey, what do you mean?
Careful, this is live streaming. Don't say anything that shouldn't be public.
Oops.
No,
Oops.
he's taking, okay. I mean, he's starting tomorrow, July 1st. He's
okay.
a new head of his
all right. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about Telluride. This is my second Telluride. The first one was 5 years ago or something. And the day I arrived, you guys made me go up 11,000 or 4,000 feet. So I'm going to hold a grudge against you. But then you made it up by, what was that? Tequila drinking?
Yes.
Okay. So all is well. Okay. So that was fun for the audience. Guys, you're missing something. The hike up the mountains, tequila drinking, and the best of all, what is it? Neuromorph? What was it? What are we called when we dance like idiots?
The parade.
Yes, the Neuromorphs in the parade.
Yeah, neuromorphs in the parade. Okay, those are the highlights. The rest of it is blah, blah, blah.
Prize-winning neuromorphs in the parade.
You got it. It was
Oh
fun.
no, multiple times. We always win. They give us like the third place every year now.
No, they give us second place because, you know, they have to give some local, okay, you know, so yeah.
On that note, we should actually get started.
Okay. Shall I proceed?
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay, so
unless Chiara, do you want to introduce?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe yes. Just say a couple of words. So are we officially starting again? Do you want to
yes,
start
we are
the
back up
recording
now.
also?
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, we are.
Good. So thanks a lot. I'm really, really proud of introducing Nitish Thakor. He's really one, I think, of the major experts in neuromorphic touch. So let me quickly tell you kind of a couple of things. He is the director of the Laboratory of Neuroengineering at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and he also has an appointment in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and is the director of the NIH training grant on neuroengineering. He does a lot of things and does research on neurological instrumentation, biomedical signal processing, micro and nanotechnologies, neuroprosthetics. Sorry, I have to read because it's a really long list. I could never remember that by heart. Clinical applications of neural and rehabilitation technologies and brain-machine interface. So I just want to add that he has done really gigantic work on collecting about 100 chapters for the Handbook of Neuroengineering for Springer. That will be published this summer. And I'm saying this because there are lots of contributions and interesting chapters that are relevant for our community, comprising chapters on neuromorphic engineering and tactile sensing. So now I leave the stage to you, Nitish. Thanks a lot for agreeing to introduce our topic.
Okay, it's my pleasure. And since it wasn't recorded, I will acknowledge that this neuromorphic workshop, which I think in future will be renamed as Tactomorphics, we hope to meet in Telluride someday so that we can hike up to 11 or 14,000 feet and dance like crazy on the street as neuromorphs. And with that, I'll just introduce the second sense to vision, since it gets a lot of attention. Okay, so first of all, to get started, I want to thank Chiara, Elisa to organize this event, and a number of others, Hans, Veronica, Alan, Stefano, everybody who has contributed. As also, there is a team behind all of this, which has been doing some work. So with all that acknowledgement, let's proceed. Okay, so I'm going to show lots of videos, okay? So while these two videos play, you can compare, okay? So I'm going to speed up the second one. Human robot, okay? So where that sense of touch and tactomorphic comes in forefront is touch. Of course, there's vision and everything else too. And humans are incredible. I mean, our ability to do dexterous manipulation with sensory and other perceptions encoded, and of course, cognitive is amazing, right? So this is where at least sense of touch comes in, and I hope these videos inspire. By the way, in interest of time, I don't have time to acknowledge everyone, but I will just go ahead with presentation. So I'm going to break it down to this major challenge area. So first, let's go with bio-neuro. So here we are talking about skin, and skin is made up of multiple receptors. You see them in the picture, and those receptors produce spikes. But it's simple: slow adaptive, fast adaptive. So fast adaptive, look for change; slow adaptive, maintain sustained sensory spiking information. So that is where our neuromorphic comes in. Skin and how it's encoded. Oh, by the way, it's not just skin. There is subcortical systems, cuneate nucleus, cortex, S1. There's a whole lot of processing. So we should do a bit more there. So there is peripheral processing, there is midbrain, and then there is cortex, okay? And no wonder we should be modeling these spiking activities. So we should model primary efference. We can model cuneate nucleus at the mid stage, and we can model the somatosensory cortex. So I think there's a plenty of opportunity here for neuromorphic spiking and modeling. I'm going to introduce some of our panel speakers. This is Hans' work. He has done a wonderful job of modeling by data recording with Slimane Bensmaya and all of that on monkeys, so that we have data on these slow and fast receptors. And he has raised some of the questions you can look over. Alan uses mouse model to understand the tactile system. And I hope we'll hear from him along the way. So, you know, we have a tactile sensory system, and it's multi-level, and all the messaging is by spiking, and neuromorphic will come in play there. So I pose few questions which can take up in the discussion. How do you model? I mean, there's a lot of modeling on FA and SA, fast and slow. Touch sim by Hans is a very good example. But higher levels, would these studies be done in rodents, monkeys, human? More to come. I'll show you something. Okay, part 2, neuromorphic. Okay, this is close to your hearts, guys. So this is my student Marques prepared this graphics. You know, we do work on prosthetics, right? So think about your natural skin on the right side, skin layer, spiking activity. On the, well, kind of my right side, your left side. The other side is a prosthetic arm. Well, we need to make an artificial skin, and it may produce spiking activity as well. And then we have to say they should be equivalent. So number of people are working in this area. Of course, this whole area of spike timing, sensory, tactile coding. So Stefano is going to present some work on his studies on rats. And he has done a number of very good papers about spike timing and at millisecond scale and so on. Then there are these challenges that with spikes, what can we do? Can we detect texture? Can we classify it? For you neuromorphs, there are problems, right? Classification, which is on the left side. Compression of data, because you know we have millions of receptors. How do you compress this information? So think of these research problems. So here are the questions. How precise should this be modeled? You know, we have relied on Izakevich model, which many of you are familiar with. It does pretty good reproduction, but do we really have to be precisely biological? A lot of us are encoding touch, but there are other things like vibration and so on. And then yesterday we heard a little bit about processors, right? GPUs and special purpose chips and so on. Should we start using them? Okay, let's move to the next one. Sensor and sensing. Number of people are working in this area, of course, but let's look at the skin. Our skin is simple, but it's complex. By the way, that's the largest organ on the body, okay? So it's a quiz question you can give to somebody. What is the largest organ in the body? It's skin. And it has got all these receptors, hair cells, free nerve endings, and so on. And they encode for touch and vibration and pressure and pain and so on. So there is a need to model the skin, the mechanics of it, right? The deformability of it, because that is what's going to get encoded. And so left side is the deformation finite element, right side is the receptor change. Nobody has dynamically modeled the two. But there is an incredible amount of work going on in developing skin-like sensors. A whole lot of people are working on organic, thin film, flexible, stretchable. In the middle, you see the video by my student about slow and fast adaptive responses on the skin-like surface that codes for the slow and fast information when you palpate. So this is a vibrant area. And, you know, it seems like we should throw a challenge out, right? How many sensors, how dense should it be? Wang Wei, who then recently worked with, in Singapore, I mean, he encoded very high density, like 1,000 channel sensor. But Veronica is on this panel, and she has been working on putting sensors on robotic fingers, working with different grasps and manipulation. So we should hear from her. And Benjamin Benty has done some marvelous work on, again, very high density sensor, but also encoding them at the highest level by using stochastic techniques and incorporate modeling hysteresis. Also, he's a terrific material scientist, so he develops these healable skins and so on. So vibrant area. So here are some questions, like what is the future here? Soft, flexible, repairable like skin, you know, we get a scratch and we still sense. High density, Moore's law, is it applicable for tactile sensing? And then biomaterials and biomimetics. Should we make the skin really biomimetic, like organic, or is it electronic, or perhaps the synthesis of the two? So we'll be discussing such questions. Okay, we move to encoding. So this was done at Telluride. You know, we had a neurologist from Australia come in, and he put micro wire in the skin on the nerve, and we are recording. My students, Luke and Wang Wei, recorded the spike activity. So you.
Nitish, we can't hear the sound because he didn't share sound, I think. Yeah, okay, you have to share sound.
Okay,
yeah.
That's okay. It's not worth it. What he's saying and showing is, hey, you are in Telluride and you are recording from your nerves, little micro needle going into the skin. And he says that these receptors are sensitive to these slow and fast events. And, you know, the students set up this palpating system on the fingers so that record. So it's amazing that we could pull it off up in the mountains. Okay, so that takes us into problems and challenges, right? Like, for example, we have skin, you have encoding, then you have to do classification, and then, I guess, stimulation to provide the percept. So this problem of classifier exists as well about edge, shape, texture, so on. And therefore, we are back to modeling, right? I mean, question to you all is, does Isakovich model with some tuning suffice, or should we really make it much more biomimetic? Because we need to palpate objects that are round and sharp and soft, and you see this blue and red spiking activity. So we would like to get an answer from you all. What's the best model for all these receptors? By the way, at Telluride, they set up this really interesting challenge, handwriting recognition. Okay, so visual and all that is fine, but how about live, dynamic, tactile, right? So you are actually on this high density system that Wang Wei set up. Then, you know, you get this movement going, and then it was a handwriting challenge, maybe a challenge for the future. You know, Friedman, Zenke, he has been working on these bio-inspired learning algorithms that are multi-layer. I heard a lot of talk, of course, about convolutional network and recurrent network and so on. So there is a lot of opportunity here. So the questions and challenges. We need algorithms for tactile encoding, variety of edge, shape, textures. Oh, we could go further from innocuous. We always think about touch, but I think we need skin for noxious stimuli, pain, to protect ourselves. So we need to encode that. How do humans palpate? How do we achieve super resolution? That's another intriguing and challenging question to discuss. Okay, moving on to perception, right? We touch, we must feel that. And so, you know, I showed you this video of, I think when you're touching the skin, you're perceiving something. If you handle an object, you know, you can't hear the robotic sound, but you can get an idea that this robot is touching round and sharp. Does the brain get it? Do you sense or feel it by looking at EEG activity or some other means, right? So like in this case, sharp, in the previous presentation, I heard about reflex. Here you go. This is a reflex. So can we encode reflex? And so this is the case, because when you touch these sharp objects, you feel pain. And these slow, fast adaptive nociceptors have to model these phenomena of reactive reflex behavior. So that's another challenge for perception. And I think I'll just play this very quickly. In fact, we work with an amputee. It was one of my former students who indeed is handling objects, and he's touching and palpating nice and round object. Of course, you can see his dexterous manipulation. But now, when he touches this sharp object, actually we give him electrocutaneous feedback and he feels that pain and reflex. He feels it. So this is one of the first examples of sensory perception at various levels. Now, we don't work alone. I mean, we meaning skin guys, we are sorry, we need vision, we need eyes. So because amputee, when goes and grasps an object, needs to see the object. So can we combine the visual neuromorphic? So this is your DVS type camera looking at the object, and the hand is now altering its posture to grasp the object correctly. So for sure, hand and eye will have to work together. And no wonder Harold at NUS is working on this visuotactile perception, where is in a robotic sense, is combining the two sensory input and develop this dynamic interaction. So there are a number of questions and challenges. How do we perceive soft and hard? Can we classify noxious stimuli? How do we best integrate vision? You saw an example, but how about proprioception, the sense of positioning? And then multisensory integration at the highest level. Okay, almost coming to the last one or two challenges. Cognition. After all, we must feel all this, right? The brain feels the, like for example, painful stimuli. So we use high density EEG to localize the stimulus, sensory activity, and painful phenomena. But as I said, sensory is not alone. In fact, it's a somatosensory. S1 and M1 cortex work with each other. Actually, they mirror. And then there's multisensory integration of visual cortex and so on. So there's these graph theoretic techniques, Catherine and Andre are developing with me, help you build these networks in the brain so that we can integrate all the sensory information. So there are some questions. Do we model S1? Do we model the whole brain network? Do we do this by intracortical recording or non-invasive EEG? And of course, everybody's functional MRI. What's the role of graph theory here? Now let's get to practical stuff. So why are we doing all this? You saw the video. We want, for example, amputees, prostheses to feel, have a sense of touch, sense of feeling. That's why we need this. We need to build fingers that are human-like. You know, these are, because we touch, we palpate, we feel texture. And every time we do that, the spiking activity gives us that information, and that's a soft and hard finger have to work together with soft and flexible skin. And so Silvestro Mechera and his group has done a lot of these kind of work. I'll skip this and I'll go to the videos. And, you know, they are applicable both in this iCube-like robot or people, because in this case, they put electrodes on and in the nerves so that the subject can palpate and tell you whether it's a soft object or a hard object or medium. And you can't hear the audio, but you know, he is able to correctly classify by intraneural stimulation. So there are questions. Is this should we go non-invasive or should we go invasive, sensory like peripheral, or should we do cortical? And then should the stimuli be delivered skin, which is practical, intraneural, so EPFL and Case Western and various groups have done a lot of progress, or intracortical, something that's happening at Hopkins and elsewhere. So these are grand challenges. So let's now finally go to translation. It's really unfortunate because I didn't set up the video audio here. So I'll just say aloud. So in this case, this doctor is palpating, the patient. And this one is a respiratory palpation. And he's saying that I'm doing percussion. If you go to a doctor, they do tapping. He looks at the spinal cord, vertebral processes, all by his skin, by his sense of touch. He's active palpation. We are not doing any more active palpation. We are just building passive sensors. So this gives you a very good example of this. I'll play another video. In this case, a doctor is palpating a shoulder region. And, he not only feels, he gets, what the video is saying is that pay attention to pain, because maybe there is thyroid, or maybe there is a tumor, or osteoarthritis. So these joints, if there is a joint, it's all very palpation. There are other examples of breast cancer, palpation, and so on. So there is a significant need for doing that. We started some work, everywhere else is going on, which is to palpate, but our sensors are crude. And at the level where we can palpate some soft tissue to get an idea, but it's really crude. I mean, our ability to palpate, managing a robot, getting a sensory feedback is extremely crude. So we have a long way to go to mimic physicians doing palpation. So I'm going to end with some looking ahead problems and applications. I think in the previous talk, somebody did mention things like gesture, right? So gesture, and I think we'll have a challenge, something like Braille recognition, because sense of touch and incorporating this True North or any other neuromorphic encoding, we could set up a challenge, which I think is a good one, which is like Braille equivalent and some others. I think that we should be incorporating virtual reality in all the work we do, because here is an amputee and they're trying to do this object recognition. So this is virtual reality training. And you look at this manipulation and touch and slip and grasp, they are all at work. Of course, there is a visual integration. So a virtual reality environment can capture, this is like wearing a HoloLens or HTC Vive or something, so that you can incorporate this, but we don't have those virtual reality, it doesn't incorporate sense of touch and proprioception. So that's another challenge. Okay. Coming to this really cutting, back to my favorite prosthesis, amputees now can control the limb really well. And so there is this motor control, right? We are controlling the motor systems, good. Hello, what about the sensory system? So now that sense of touch, okay. How about feeling? That you touch somebody and that you get that feeling back. We don't know what that is, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that we must combine sensory, perception, cognition into a holistic solution. So it may be that there is a role for fully implantable, some kind of fancy glove to nerve or maybe brain system. Of course, implantable work is going on. I already mentioned that Silvestro and his group are working in a European community group with Italy, IIT, Germany. They've incorporated this pretty well, right? So now the robotic hand manipulation, Stanisa at ETH has done something similar for the lower limb. Again, you cannot hear the audio, but he implanted neural electrodes in the leg to the nerve, and by applying a pressure to the foot, the subject is able to say, where is the sense of touch? So this is very good for people who have diabetic foot or amputation and such. So, upper limb, lower limb, getting a sensory feedback. And then of course, the last frontier is the brain. So this is an example of at University of Pittsburgh, where now there is a direct cortical microstimulation, and the subject is correctly identifying correctly identifying which finger is being touched. And this is at Johns Hopkins. He has got 2 set of electrodes. And again, and unfortunately you can't hear the audio, so I'll say that he says, I feel something, but I can't tell you what exactly it is. Kind of very ambiguous sensations. So he's getting this kind of ambiguous sensation. And so we don't know whether we are correctly microstimulating his, or his brain hasn't adapted to this unnatural stimuli. Tremendous frontier here. And so last but not the least, I mean, we seem to be caught up in this whole robotic, mechatronic, neuromorphic techno jargon. And how about the aesthetics of the skin? How about human coexistence? And last but not the least, the ethical issues, right? Which is, there's a whole lot of, at least I see this trend towards cyborg-like development. I suppose it can be said that you're assisting, but there are certain connotations. And, are we forgetting human beings here and there? Young children, people with disability who lost limb due to mines. So this field of tactomorphic is very broadly applicable to human. So there are many frontiers to recap and to conclude. First and foremost, skin, modeling, all of that, making skin-like materials, sensors, making skin-like sensors, soft, flexible, repairable. Of course, our favorite neuromorphic encoding, slow, fast, but then beyond other receptors, pain receptors. Then application to prosthetics and robotics, humanoid. And then we will overlook, and this is not the place, but neuroscientists, cognitive scientists would be looking into perception, cognition, and then back to applications, action, and then translation. So I've laid out a bunch of frontiers for you. There are a bunch of take-home messages. I would love for us to create some grand challenge, right? So that everybody gets behind it. Of course, Telluride gives us these little micro challenges that we can do. Could be for Braille, could be texture, so on. It'll capture the imagination. We should never forget the basic neuroscience foundations. But one of the things that this field, as Anish says, that it needs intense integration of sensing, materials, electronics, and all cutting edge, flexible sensors, organic materials, organic thin film electronics, you name it. Then, of course, there is multi-institutional, Europe does it better. In US, there are these Muri-like effort, but are not as much to my knowledge in this field. And that creates really tremendous solution. I heard yesterday that there's a lot of neuromorphic entrepreneurship companies have started up. Not so much to my knowledge. Benti may have done some work on tactile. We have done some work on prosthetics, but industry partnership is lacking in this area to some extent. Looking at US, there has been, of course, NIH, NSF, DARPA support, but we should provide more challenge. But I want to kind of take home is that we need to take these ideas from patents to patents, products, patients, right? Palpation as an example, let's help the patient, help the amputees. So those are my take home messages. This is really unfortunate that that audio cannot be heard. So this amputee plays piano, and it's very touching that the sound of this piano is amazing to see that sort of hand prosthesis sense is kind of coming alive. So I think I'm going to end there because we have a lot of questions. I don't know how I'm doing on time. So let me stop the share so that I have some cue from you guys. How am I doing on the time? And accordingly, we can go into Q&A. So thank you for having me here. And, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And next time I'll do the audio thing so that you get this robot clicking along and wonderful piano playing by an amputee.
Thanks a lot, Nitish. I think for time, you did very well. So we are on time and we have time for the panel discussion. I think it's really interesting. I mean, you gave a very broad overview of the field, and we clearly understand that something has been done, but there are still so many open questions and challenges that there's hope to work on this topic for years now, and it's exciting. There are many things we can do. So I don't know if there are questions. Let me check.
While you look up the question, may I make a comment?
Sure.
May I congratulate Switzerland, since INI people, a lot of you are here, for winning an incredible game yesterday. It was amazing. No due respect to the French, but you Swiss, you made yourself proud. And Italians, you guys are doing great too. So good luck. I'm talking about football for Americans. They have no idea what I'm saying, but I'm talking about soccer and football. So well done.
Thanks. Nice that you're following the European Cup. So no, there's no question. So I think, I don't know.
I have a quick question for Nitish.
Sure.
This is Jeff. Hi.
Hello.
And thanks for bringing up the tequila party and the hike. I remember that too. So when you look at recordings, from the primary sensory neurons, in the skin, do you think it's a rate code that's coming off of these different types of, because there's so many different types of receptors, or do you think it's more of a spike time or a temporal code, or do you think it's a mix?
Yeah, well, of course.
And I'm talking about when you're just looking at the recordings, because I've looked at them and I can't tell. It looks like a rate, but I mean, you've looked at them more than I have.
No, it's a sophisticated question with actually very poor data quality. The reason is that if you do it in human, it's a very painful needle going in for a very short time, and you do the palpation. Actually, my son had a nerve injury, and I observed, and just pokes it in, he's ouch, 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 and there's quick reaction to see if the nerve is producing spiking activity. So we don't really get enough data, although now Sliman and Hans and Pierre have done a lot more recording on monkeys. And I think I would consider that there's a lot of transient response. There's fast adaptive or transient, because they're looking at it kind of like equivalent of edge detection or something. And slow adaptive, I would like to think it's a bit more rate encoding, but now all the other questions are more the further up the stream, right? So when you ask ciliate nucleus and sensory cortex, then what your question is more appropriate. And honestly, I'm not an expert. I wish somebody, people like Sliman or Hans, if people were here, then they might answer that.
Maybe we can ask this question later during the presentation of Alan and of Hannes. That will be next week. So keep this question for them. Yeah. Anybody else wants to ask a question?
Just to convey while you're thinking about it, is that there is a marriage of sensors, equivalent of your DVS and so on. We don't have a unique common platform for tactile sensors distributed to everyone. And that's, like what DVS did to vision. Then there is this whole neuromorphic part. And I think we have a lot to learn from vision community and so on. So that's good. But after that, again, we are back into much more human sensory perception, cognition, and interaction, which is, there's a lot we can do. So I hope one thing I would like to see in a future Telluride is this collaboration among the groups that are across different senses, and then working with the encode algorithm people, working with the hardware people. And maybe people like Kiara, you guys should set up a challenge so that these young people can get behind it in that short time, work long hours, drink tequila.
That's true. That's true. I mean, one thing we are working on is really trying to understand which is the best way to encode the tactile signal. And we have, the freedom now to do it sort of in simulation. So as most of people do, is kind of a sort of soft neuromorphic engineering, where you have still a clocked prompt and interpolation, and then study which is the neural model or the mechanoreceptor model that you can use to correctly encode the information and have then, a better decoding afterwards. And then from there, design the circuit. So we are exactly working on these aspects that I think is really crucial. So what about moving to the panel? So we have more contribution to this discussion. think I can leave we can leave the kind of the screen to Elisa, who is going to moderate the panel and introduce all the people who will contribute.
Yeah, let me share my screen. If I can, I don't know if I'm. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello, so my name is Elisa, and together with Chiara, we are leading the group of the TAC work group. And today I'm here as a moderator for the panel discussion of this second talk of the second day. And we have 5 speakers. Actually, I saw that also Veronica is here, so I don't know if you want to join us. It would be nice. But I'm sorry, I don't have a picture, so I'm not going to present you. So we start. I mean, our speakers are Nitish, that he made this wonderful presentation, and we are gonna take inspiration from his presentation because he already introduced all the challenges that we have when we work with tactile sensors and we want to perform this form of sensing. So we're going to take and try to summarize the question and try to address the question to the speakers. Then we have Chiara Bartolazzi. Chiara Bartolazzi is a researcher at the Italian Institute of Technology, where she leads the event-driven perception for robotic groups, with the aim of applying the neuromorphic engineering approach to the design of robotic platforms as enabling technology towards the design of autonomous machines. And we have Friedemann Zenke, so that I can see him, so he's here. So, and Friedemann started his own group in 2019 at the Friedrich Miescher Institute for Biomedical Research in Basel, Switzerland. And his group tackles theoretical questions related to learning and memory in biologically inspired neural networks. So it's gonna give us some help from the computational point of view to this challenge of the tactile sensing. We have Elisabetta Chicca. Elisabetta, she's also part of our group. And Elisabetta, she recently moved and now she's a full professor at the Zernike Institute for Advanced Materials and Groningen Cognitive Systems and Materials Center. And Elisabetta's current interests are in the development of CMOS models of cortical circuits for brain-inspired computation, learning in spiking CMOS neural networks, and memoristic systems. Bio-inspired sensing, so she works on vision, olfaction, active electrolocation, audition, and touch, of course, and motor control. So then we have Benjamin T. Benjamin T is a President's Assistant Professor at National University of Singapore, where he leads the Sensor AI System Labs. He has worked on large area tactile sensing for robotics, medical devices, and prosthetic applications, including flexible, stretchable, and transparent technologies. So these are our speakers. So now we can start with the first question. So starting from the presentation of Nitish, so we try to summarize in 4 groups and we have 4 questions. And the first question is about encoding. So encoding and computation. So of course, when you touch some surface, when you want to recognize an object, so you have to touch, but at the same time you move your hand, you move your finger. So of course you need to have information from multiple sources. So we have, I mean, the touch sensor itself, but there is also the proprioception. So for example, if you have a robot, so the robot has to move in the space. So you need to know how the robot is moving. And you need to keep, of course, in consideration this information. So at the end, we need to combine all these different sources. And the question is, how can we combine all these different sources to improve tactile recognition? Because we have multiple challenges, right? So we have the problem of how to solve these multiple sensors, but also how to learn temporal sequence. Because when I move on an object, of course, I need to keep memory of where I'm moving or what I was touching. So we need to process this temporal sequence, this temporal information. So the question is, so how we can combine, and a question is also why should we do it by using spiky neural networks or neuromorphic computing in general? compare, of course, to traditional computing. So I don't know if Friedemann wants to start since we're talking about computation and encoding. So
sure, I'm happy to start. Can you hear me actually?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, Nitish, for the nice talk. That was really great. And I think it really nicely put the stage or set the stage for talking about these questions, because I think one thing that's really fascinating about senses, and specifically also somatosensory sensing, is that time is really an intrinsic dimension to the stimulus, right? So like most stimuli, you're touching a texture or something like this will be encoded in a time series. And then you're already halfway with the spikes. I think, of course, you can encode time in an analog continuous signal, but that requires a lot of bandwidth. It's also energetically maybe not ideal, and especially in the body, it's probably more robust to transmit spikes. So I think one really central aspect is that processing of touch is intrinsically tied to the processing of time, therefore recurrent neural networks. And neurons, specifically spiking neurons, they have the internal recurrent dynamics. They process time, they filter time, they have nonlinear properties even on their own. And then, of course, they're embedded in larger networks, which are made to process such temporal signals. So whether we necessarily have to have binary spikes, that might be, in my opinion, something that nature largely uses for convenience, because that's something it could come up with efficiently. But I think the temporal aspect is really essential, and the ability of neurons to integrate these things in an analog manner and integrate on multiple timescales and process like this. So that's, I think, the second part of your question. And while talking, I've probably forgot the first part of the question, but maybe somebody else wants to chime in. Right, the integration of multiple sources. So I think that's definitely challenging, and it's also a super exciting topic to tackle. I think, as with anything, we probably should start with the passive presentation of stimuli, or passive touch if you want, or even though this will only capture a very, very small area of the processing required, or the processing that we do. But it will give us first good ideas, and we have this Braille challenge, for instance, that does this largely in a passive way, even though, as the participants will see, there's a robotic finger being moved over the letters. For now, that's being basically done at a constant speed. Now, of course, if you were the reader that's controlling that robotic hand or this prosthesis, you would control the speed by which you're reading, and you might go back actually to read something that you didn't quite catch. All of this ultimately will have to be integrated, but I think it's good to start with the open loop setup on that part of the processing, and then tackle the closed loop setup. And there, I think a lot of challenges will come from the fact that this closed loop system is not differentiable. And we will have a lot of problems with learning required representations, and probably this will put us into the domain of reinforcement learning to teach neuromorphic systems and artificial intelligence systems, basically, to figure out what's the optimal strategy actually to use the sensor to get the information that the system needs.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. I don't know if someone wants to make a comment on that, because of course, I mean, if you have also multiple sources, and if you want to explore this temporal sequence, you need also to try to synchronize. I mean, try to find also the same time constants that you have from different sources, because sometimes the problem is that if you have, especially if you work with robots, sometimes, I don't know, the IMU, the proprioception, so they have these sensors that are really high frequency, so you receive a lot of data, and you need to synchronize maybe with a completely different sensors that has a different time constant. So it is also a problem of time scale. And you have to keep in mind when you create this large network, and you need to understand how to combine them. So I don't know if Nitish wants to make a
Well,
comment.
I had plenty of time to speak, so I just want to defer to others. But your point well made. See, in vision, you have rods and cones. In skin, you have minimally at least 4 receptors. Then on top of that, we have pain receptors. And then proprioception, as you mentioned, which then needs to integrate in nerves, which are much more poorly understood than the retina or the visual cortex. And so while vision takes a lot of glamour and attention, we really have a harder multisensory or multi-receptor integration problem.
Okay, thanks. And Elisabetta, do you have any comments, since you are an expert of motor control, an expert of different sensor modalities?
Yes, thanks, Elisa. Yeah, I wanted to comment on what was said by Friedman, and also make links to the talk by Nitish, which was very, very interesting, by the way. So first of all, Friedman was mentioning about the time, and how time plays an important role in general in sensing, but of course, as well as in touch. And if we can make again the parallel with vision, it's for me kind of shocking that in touch, the artificial system went somehow in the same direction of conventional vision. This is something that Chiara also touched yesterday, that event-based sensing makes a lot of sense in touch. And this is relatively unexplored. So I think this is something we have to push for, that as close as possible to the sensors, we come out with spikes. And that brings me to the link to what Nitish was asking about, what kind of computational substrate we can use. And if you think that you have the spikes very close to the sensor, then you can start thinking about doing very low power, compact computation, again, close to the sensor, so that you only have to transmit data that are not rough data anymore, that is not the pressure of the sensor, but something more, already some understanding of what the finger or the skin here is perceiving. And then to link back to the sensor fusion, I think a fascinating place to start is touch and proprioception, to be, again, linking to what was said about closing the loop, about this Braille reading. Of course, as soon as you have the motor controlling the speed, you can do some intelligent behavior there, and then use proprioception as another sense to be merged with touch, so that you can do more clever touch in that way. And then, of course, all the complications arise, because, proprioception, I would say, is even less understood than touch, but that's why it would be an interesting place to do research about.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to all the speakers. So I would move to the next question, especially because we were talking about sensors, we're talking about substrates. So we can move to the question more on sensors and more on sensing. So, and speaking on the material, so how can we build these particular sensors? So what is the future of soft, flexible, and reparable tactile sensors? What biomaterials best mimic skin? So in this case, I think that since for the first question they were silent, maybe Benjamin and Chiara, they can try to address this question. Benjamin, I think you're muted. You can hear.
Yes, hi. It's well, very I guess it's good morning here. Well, it's very early morning for me. It's like 1 a.m. So hope everyone's doing fine. Thanks again for this organizing this panel. And Nitish, wonderful talk, and really sets the tone for this panel actually. So I think Chiara has also done a lot of remarkable work on soft and flexible sensors on the iCloud skin. So I started a bit, so she was sort of a model, a pioneer in this field when I started this research. So I follow a lot of her excellent, I guess, paths that she has created. I think for me, I'm personally quite interested in, I think, the mechanics of skin, which is very dynamic, right? I mean, actually, if you think about human skin, it doesn't have a single fixed modulus. The hardness and softness varies quite tremendously across, even different areas of your hands, right? From your fingertips to your palm areas and the back of your hand. All these are very different material properties. So I think, and also density, right? And I think that the future of tactile sensors would need to adapt to having the ability to sense across different types of mechanics of the material, from very stiff regions where the contact may not be so frequent, to more softer, more fleshy regions like your fingertips that can give you more information, right? I think Nitish mentioned something about computation of the mechanics and simulation of mechanics. Actually, when you have a very soft material conforming to surfaces, the fact that it is soft and the temporal dynamics of that contact gives you a lot of information about the surface. So we've found this also in some of our work recently on trying to scale up sensors to have higher density and still maintain the high speed. And that's what we found, is that having the right kind of material mechanics to contact the surface gives you more information than, say, for example, a very stiff surface contacting another surface. So I think we really need to think about how to have distributed and varying mechanical properties of the skin, and you still have it work at the same time, right? And this goes back to a lot of the AI algorithms that need to come in to address these different mechanics very quickly and to learn, right? I think end of the day, having very high density sensors also means you generate a lot of data, and we need better algorithms, more efficient algorithms to learn the contact mechanics over time, because and that is really the push of deep learning, and why it's so popular is because you don't really need a lot of code. You feed a lot of data over time, it learns. And I haven't really seen this happen a lot yet in the some of the tactile algorithms being developed. So I think this is quite a really exciting area also for AI scientists to look at, right? How different mechanics can be taught in the algorithm side, so that we don't have to code every single feature, right, to detect. I think as for how dense you want, I think the human system is a good enough model. I think we can mimic. Fingers have about 1,000 sensors on your fingertip, right? And your hands roughly about 10,000 or more. So these also varies depending on how often they come into contact. Usually the fleshy parts, the softer parts have a lot more sensors than the stiffer parts. For example, the back of your hand. And the question of biological versus biomimetic, I think is a good question. I think as engineering, when we use artificial systems like electronic systems, we can go above and beyond what biological systems can do, right? And I think that is quite interesting. For example, we can have new sensory modalities like proximity, right? That isn't really available in human skin, right? Human skin don't sense proximity, right? And so having some of these electrical, I guess, fusion can build on top of the biological or biomimetic nature and actually create more advanced skins that will be more suitable for certain applications. So I think that's kind of definitely very interesting to integrate and go beyond what the nature has sort of evolved to do. Yeah. But anyway, I've spoke too much, but thank you.
I have a question to the group. about sensors which are not biologically motivated? You know, like, for example, if you want to know the surface of the texture, you could probably, I mean, you could use a little other device, a proximity device that actually will behave like skin, but it's not really just biology doesn't have sensory devices that we have as engineers. Do you think that's really reasonable?
I think so. Like, for example, time of flight,
yes,
you know, sensors and so on. Those are something that nature doesn't have as a toolkit, right? So, but engineers have, and so this, I think, this goes to really exciting areas where we start to combine and move beyond what biological systems have evolved. I think that's really exciting, and there is some early work now integrating proximity, time of flight, so you can even scan the surface just by moving your hand, for example, and you can get a topographical map. Those are quite exciting work. I think we haven't really looked into the neuromorphic aspect, which would make it a lot more power efficient.
And also infrared. I mean, you can buy now an infrared camera for like $15 and a time of flight for imager for a $20 from SparkFun for Arduino, you know, with SPI interface. So
it's right, and we just need to slap on the neuromorphic into them. I think that's the cool part. Yeah.
I think that with respect to biology, probably engineering solutions, they are more kind of narrow. So a certain transducer, a certain technology can respond to very narrow stimuli at best. So the concept of combining different technologies and having hybrid systems with different materials, different transducers, using different technologies like infrared, optical sensors, the time of flight, but also magnetic sensors or inertial. These can combined probably mimic some of the richness that we have in biology and probably do even more. So there are a lot of studies on how to, develop things for and processing for each different sensor type. It would be very cool to integrate them. Of course, it's difficult, right? If you want to put different sensing technologies on the fingertip of a robot, well, you have a big miniaturization problem there. You cannot go very, very big. I think that in touch, we have also the complexity or the freedom to have, different materials, but also different transducers, and also play with the placement of the sensors. This is something that I think it's very interesting. So we have different areas. Benjamin has explained that different areas have different resolution, but also the design of the receptors of tactile units is done in a way that increases the resolution of the system. So instead of having receptive fields that are, have a uniform shape, you start mixing the senses of the sensing units of different neurons in a way that you can have higher resolution than when you in the perception than you would expect from the mere resolution of the placement of the sensing units. So these are all design strategies that we can look into to improve the technology. And I think the way to go is really, as Benjamin was saying, having hybrid systems where we integrate different properties with sensors and materials with different bandwidth, different softness to capture the wide range of different tactile stimuli.
Okay.
If I can say a comment about Ben's work, I mean, he's so perfectly positioned. He has done synthetic skin-like materials and then electronics and then encoding. I think that's the kind of work that needs to happen. Veronica does a lot of applications. So the idea is that I think this kind of integration is the answer. And amazingly, this field of soft electronics, soft robotics is also peaking. So that means we are excellently positioned to take advantage of all the technology for this field, our tactile neuromorphic work.
Okay. Thanks for the comments. And I think we can move to the next question that is even quite related, because it's more on practical aspect of using these sensors. So it's more, so in the presentation of Nitish, we saw example of neuroprosthetic devices, of robotics. And the question is, there are some fundamental differences between these tactile sensor when they're applied in neuroprosthetic devices or robotics. There is something that can be shared, or there is something that need to be differentiated. So any comment on that? I guess that related to the question that the previous question, I guess that there are differences. So we can play with material, we can play with distribution of sensors and resolution of sensors. So any comment for the aspect of robotics or prosthetic devices? So Chiara, Nitish, Benjamin.
Chiara, you should start.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, it was a question that I asked myself, and I'm not so expert in the part of prosthetics design, but the question is, in a way, the types of applications, at least when you think about humanoid robotics. Okay, so it's a very specific field of robotics. You think about hands, you think about tasks that a robot should do in a similar way to humans in a human-centered environment. So interacting with the same type of objects and trying to do very similar tasks. So I imagine that the sensing technology should be similar, but what we want as information from the sensor and how we are going to use this information in the prosthetic application and the robotic application might be very different, because in a way, in one of the applications, like in robotics, there's all this problem of the closed loop that robot needs to close. So deciding which is the action to perform to increase the acquisition of information and perform the correct action to correctly perceive and gather information about the object. While in the prosthetic domain, well, maybe you don't need that because it's a human that closes the loop. If you can send a meaningful tactile information to the user. So I don't know if these two problems have a lot in common, or they need very different approaches, and maybe Nitish and Veronica will be the two people that can answer this question. I think I have more questions than answers in this case.
Well, I can chime in and go ahead, Nitish.
No. I was thinking we give Veronica a chance. She's there, and I've spoken enough. So Veronica and others take over.
Thank you. The way that we think about it is more of this continuum of shared autonomy, and you have extremes, maybe full human control on one end and full robot control on the other. And I always think that there's a human in the loop somewhere for good human robot systems. But depending on your application and task, you're going to lie in different places along that continuum. So for the example of robots that you might want to send to semi-autonomously do maybe handling of dangerous materials, you might want to build in some of that more abstract perception and decision making into the robot, but you may not want to send the same type of high-level abstract information such as texture or weight to an amputee. For prosthetics, the way that I think about it is that I would rather have the human doing the learning. Let's give the human as much rich information as possible and let them learn through their own action perception loop, which is a very different way of thinking about learning that you might want to do offline for a robotic system that's going to work with minimal human supervision.
Okay. Thanks, Veronica. So I don't know if someone has any kind of comment, because I think we're running out of time. So I will move to the last question. And
But comments, I do like the background Veronica has. Very cool.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh no, I said the background. Veronica's painting is very suitable.
Also known as my dining room. This is a 12,000 piece puzzle.
Wow, beautiful.
So let's move to the last question. Let's try to, I think this question is, okay, in this case is for these sort of tactile sensors and for touch sensing, but I think it's a quite general question. So in the community of neuromorphic computing, it's quite difficult to find a benchmark and try to define data set for our sensors. So of course, for vision, for DVS, we have multiple sensors, and this the one is the most studied. So, but for the other sensor and for in general for neuromorphic computing, we still don't have a benchmark or way of doing benchmark. So can you comment something like how can we build data sets?
Well, I think we missed the last part of your question, probably.
Sorry?
I think we missed the last part of your question.
Sorry, my connection is unstable. So I'll just say, so the question is, how can we design data set? How can we design experiment and benchmark to highlight the properties of neuromorphic approach? And in this case, of course, is related to touch sensing, but I think it's quite general question. In any case, that's where we need to benchmark temporal sequence, where we need to benchmark system that classify, learn temporal sequences.
I think the tactile example, the Braille, the Friedman was talking about before, is one of these data sets where you really encode the information in the temporal sequence, because it depends on when you hit the certain taxel and the relationship between the activations of different taxes over time. I think the most difficult one will be a data set where we can also test the adaptation capabilities of the neuromorphic systems that we keep claiming, that neuromorphic systems will have the capability to adapt to changes in the environment and to be less brittle to an unconstrained scenario. But so far, we don't really have a data set or a benchmark on how to test this, at least not to my knowledge.
I think that's a really good point. And I think there's, in deep learning, there's a lot of nice data set like ImageNet and so on, right? I think the amount of data that they have is actually tremendous. Whereas for neuromorphic data sets, what we're trying to do actually is the opposite, right? We're trying to compress the data. So we're actually having less data. I think that's sort of one of the slightly more difficult challenge to come up with a ultimate, right? And because the benchmark isn't amount of data. I think the benchmark is about the quality and the feature that can be learned from the data that is a bit different from traditional deep learning kind of algorithms. I think Chiara's right. Actually, the type of task is also something that we have to think about. Like having some like a challenge of sort would be interesting, right? That can be benchmarked to human capability, right? I think I'm not sure about human reading Braille, but I assume there's also the learning is actually also pretty fast. So if there's a way to have the data set actually present a challenge that more people can participate and try to extract features from with neuromorphic algorithms, I think that would be nice, and that should hopefully form the basis for more data sets in more varied scenarios compared to traditional ImageNet type of data sets.
To add to that, I've always found that this idea of shareable tactile data sets has been... Sorry, I can hear background noise. this idea of shareable tactile data sets, I know that the touch community has been trying to mimic what the computer vision community has, and to some extent, I mean, there are challenges, obviously, in terms of how to collect the data. You can go online and download millions and millions of images, but actual, robots or physical systems have to go out to collect tactile data. So it takes time, there's wear, it's very difficult to collect that much data. And another point is that for images, while you have different lighting conditions, for example, you might be able to normalize for that. But for tactile sensing, because of this very tight relationship between action and perception, I don't know yet how to normalize for contact force, for movement speed, for the stiffness of the sensor. And so I think that's a little bit why you see labs doing their own thing with whatever sensors they have on hand, because it is so difficult to benchmark for different physical systems as you're collecting these data.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, as with all data sets, it's probably going to be an iterative procedure. And I think actually taking the neuromorphic principle really here as a guide, or the biology as a guide, is presumably a good starting point. You could start anywhere, and we probably have to run through multiple iterations ultimately to find the ultimate data set or benchmark. I think it's very much task dependent, and I think there might be not one ultimate benchmark in the end. It's really depending on the question that you're asking. But just one comment on the image net competitions or these vision data sets, right? In a way, it's also a little bit of a contrived challenge that computer vision has been solving there, because of course it's vastly simplified. Looking at still images, it's a vastly simplified problem. It's not how vision really works, right? We saccade, we have foveation, our eyes move. It's actually also quite an active sense, maybe not as active as touch. But there's self-motion. Usually there's also time in visual perception intrinsically, which is all kind of getting rid of by looking at still images. And that's because we know how to take photographs and we kind of used to look at them, and we don't have the same thing for touch. And I think it's something we should keep in the backs of our heads, that maybe also for vision, a lot of the concepts that will come through this closed loop, and considering the closed loop acquisition of sensory data, might be opportunities to actually improve also vision. And I think vision is intrinsically hard because it has so many channels, there's so many pixels, and perhaps if we start with maybe not the finger of a piano player, but some more coarse touch, like maybe the touch perception I have in the back of my back, which is maybe not so precise. Maybe there were concepts that we can learn ultimately here that we can later apply also to other senses. Anyway, I think it's an iterative procedure, and it will also come back to the vision people at some point.
Okay, so thanks to all the speakers. Thanks for your comments. And I think that maybe since we are all the most expert of touch here in this work, in this Telluride, why don't we sit together? Maybe we discuss about some common line for designing dataset or benchmark. Can be an idea. So okay, so thanks again to all of you. And I think that we can close the panel discussion here. We are already quite late. I think we are 20 minutes late, but no one stopped me, so I guess it's fine.
Thanks, Elisa. So, Terry. Terry, you.
Yes, it's time to end. Thank you for the participation of all the expert panel, the topic area, and all the great speakers today. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Tomorrow.
And see you tomorrow.